Today we're going to be going over 3 of the biggest investors in the world and what they're doing as far as their stocks and going over their current portfolios that have recently been updated. David Taper, owner of the Carolina Panthers, Michael Burry, Big Short, Warren Buffett. Don't have to describe the guy. The first thing we're going to go over is Warren Buffett's because it's probably the most concerning out of all of these. And the first thing you jump into and realize isn't what he's bought on the top. It's the bottom side of this. And that's him getting totally out of SPY and VU. Worth mentioning. Now, I will say this is getting the most hype out of everything is that he's getting out of SPY and VU. But it's worth mentioning that that was a pretty small position. I will say you can see that's 0.01% of his portfolio, but he has no exposure to VU or to SPY. That is worth mentioning. But again, I think the biggest thing you have to realize is the percentage impact on his portfolio. Like people want to say, oh, he's selling out. Again, it was already not that large of a percentage of his account. The other thing to realize is Buffett has been in cash now for almost 2 years or heavy into cash, getting more and more cash on hand. But again, those are the things that I've really been paying a lot of attention to. He also is selling banks, which I think is a really interesting viewpoint here. Citigroup, Capital One, Bank of America. Though that in itself is the more interesting thing as we look at a whole here. He reduced new holdings by 53%. That was a pretty big position cut. But again, the biggest thing I'm looking at is how much he reduced his overall bank holdings. Because again, if you look at XLF and what's happened there, this is the banking ETF on the daily time frame. It's probably been one of the best overall sectors in the market for the past year and a half, 2 years. Really had a good run. You know, once you broke above $41, your previous all-time high, you can see back here, you quickly took off like in a hurry, right? So XLF, interesting that he's getting out of this. I don't necessarily think that XLF is bearish here just yet. I would assume that he is pricing in what's happening as far as potential cuts going forward. We'll see what's happening as well. Then obviously the Trump administration is pretty volatile here with what's happening with banks and the overall dollar. But I still think XLF looks really good. As long as you hold above $50, $51, I don't know how you can be bearish. But I will say this is more of just a cut on his portfolio. As you can see, getting rid of some of the exposure. The names that he did add, in my opinion, are more speculative. He's been adding Oxy, which is an oil name, so that's not surprising. He's been buying every chance he can get. Constellation Brands, more of a food brand. Sirius XM, this is one of the more known sectors he's been buying. Pretty steady, nothing really changes there on Siri. As you go back into that as well, kind of buying a bottom here. Interesting. I will say as well, you know, Buffett just likes the stock, but again, you're not really breaking out yet. Yeah, I would get pretty bullish on Sirius XM if you can break back above around 33 or get it back above like 29. But again, the way that Buffett's looking at the market is not from a short-term viewpoint. So he's just buying where he sees value. Important to understand that as well. And then he obviously had added a major purchase into Pool and Domino's. Domino's is just hilarious to think about. During COVID, it went berserk. Right after COVID, we're kind of on the rally back into highs as well. Still looks pretty solid above 480. Looks good into 550, 540. And then obviously going into Pool, which is funny that Pool was a pretty crazy name back here in 2019 to 2021. And then obviously it slowed down here. But Buffett likes his stocks that are pretty consistent. You can see, you know, you're just sitting at around $320, $300. You know, break below 300, yeah, there's pain, but it's been a buy here so far back into 400, 440, so still looks good there. That's essentially, though, the biggest things that's happening here on Buffett's portfolio. This is probably the least interesting of all of them, in my opinion. He did get rid of T-Mobile as well. I don't really care about that. Okay, so for Michael Burry's, I want to go about this a little bit differently because, again, I think Michael Burry gets too much praise, to be honest. I will say he has been pro-China stocks for a while now. They're just now paying off, but it's not like a super unpopular opinion based off of big investors right now. This website just gives you a really cool view. It's called Well Wisdom. You can go look at this. So the top buys, Estee Lauder, makeup company, Pinduoduo, Chinese, HCA Healthcare, BRKR, VFC, and the biggest holdings, Baba, Baidu, obviously it's a lot of Chinese names here, JD, Baidu, Baba, right? You can also see some puts there. Now, I had to go do a little digging here to really get a better view. But again, these are the most recent updated positions as well. So again, he had some JD puts, most likely hedging his position, long JD with some JD puts. Might have been selling those as well. Didn't go too much into detail there. That is worth mentioning. But this is quarter number 3, 2024. But this is the most recent update of him buying more Baba, Baidu, JD and SD Lauder, which is the biggest update, which is date filed February 14th. Important to understand that as well. So again, I don't want to go too much over Michael Burry's. The big thing here is that he's heavy China. Like, this is the story here on Michael Burry. You can go and look at, how he's allocated this. I don't think really most of his names that he's played over the past 2 years have been awesome. He was going short all from 2020, like the end of 2022, the beginning part of 2023. During this whole bull run, he kept saying short this and that. And I agree, like, some of it didn't make sense of us moving, but at a certain point in time, you got to just admit you're wrong. Kind of never did, but it is what it is. So a big thing with Michael Burry is China, which brings us into David Taper, which I think is the most interesting of all, in my opinion, because again, he basically went on CNBC and told everyone, like, look, if there's an opportunity out there right now, it's China. He said our normal risk management, risk tolerance to a specific equity, futures, whatever it may be, he says is X amount, but we're almost doubling that risk amount or risk tolerance that we're willing to have with China. It's a backup, the truck type event. So again, he adds more BABA, he adds Pinduoduo, JD, which again, 43% to JD. He's really spreading out here. Now, we'll say he added some AMD, so that's a skeptical decision at best. But again, really, really interesting overall here. And going into some of these names, and I do want to cover some of what's happening here. JD has been pretty interesting as well. And what I would really do is go back to like 2021, 2022. Granted, like that was euphoria with Chinese names and what was happening there. But I mean, you still as a whole look pretty damn good on some of these names, like especially if you start to break out of where you're at right now. And so you can kind of see here as well, you go to JD, bring this around here. This is clearly your resistance, into that $50. You're at pretty big points. It's hard to not admit that, right? You get above $50, you start getting pretty illiquid back to the upside. Pinduoduo, this was the Temu name, really been killing it over the past year. Had a really good run from 2023 into 2024. Definitely slowed down around 152. If you can ever get above 152, you're probably going to all-time highs. But even here, it's still really interesting back into that 150 area. I think you're getting a little aggressive here, I will say, if you can start loading up. But again, just quick stops, what I'd be watching for is getting back below this little level here, back below 120. So if you're trying to buy, you just want to hold 120 and then pushing up to there. The interesting part about most of these names as well is if you're looking at trading these names and you don't really know what to do, how I would look at them is trading leaps, dated options on these, because it'll give you, again, the best position and just the best feel, so you don't have to get out of a trade too quick. Maybe there's not as much volatility that will scare you out of the trade. And it'll really let you get in a position where you can let a trade run, right? And the way that I look at leaps is leveraging shares, basically. So instead of buying, $2,000 worth of shares of Pinduoduo, I can buy a $2,000 option, which one or two contracts, whatever it may be, a year or 2 years out. And, that contract could, from 120 into 150 could, in theory, move, 50 to 60% rather than moving just the, 20%, 25% there as well, depending on the speed in which it moves. But it just gives you a better position. And again, I think you saw it here as well, like Burry hedging positions, like JD specifically. That's really what options are made for as well. Giving you more capital to work with, and what you're doing there as well. So again, how I'm viewing all these names. Now, again, you guys know I love BABA. I think as long as you hold, 120 to 124, this is beautiful. I've covered this already, but again, you had this really nice test here on Friday, and I want to see one more test to be more confident here. But you get the gap up, you come back down to your level, you bounce. I mean, picture perfect. Nothing can get too much better than that. That's ultimately what you wanted to see here. And again, it seems like the common denominator here is like China. I will say Warren's investments not as China, obviously, but I definitely think Warren is trying to balance the books, get more in cash, and set up the next phase of what's going to happen with Berkshire. This has kind of been the trend over the past year and a half, right? He sold Apple. He sold a lot of his other big names as well. So again, that's where they're at. I don't want to speak on Warren's mindset with all this, but again, it's really interesting what's happening there. But as I look at all these accounts, and you can go more into like Kathy Wood and all the other ones there was a lot released recently. You're going to find like China was one of the biggest buys overall, like between a lot of these accounts. So I still will go into that. I still think China, if I'm looking at sectors as a whole, I think China is very, very, very hot. One thing I will leave you with too is Taper also is buying ASML around 160. Kind of crazy to think about that. He bought LRCX. So he's also buying the smaller, less talked about semiconductor names as well. I mean, ASML before this, if you remember, was getting wrecked down at 725, went all the way down to 680. It was a buying opportunity. So overall, still like where we're at, still like the opportunities there. I think you have a lot coming up. I think China was the main focus of all these 13Fs and what I'd be tracking and what I'd be following. So definitely like be watching the Chinese names out there. Baba, Pinduoduo, JD, Baidu. Those are the big ones I'd be watching. Baba being my favorite in the short term as well. Follow for more content. I appreciate you. All the links are down below as well.